Leningrad is encircled. Guderian and Kleist are just days from meeting behind the ancient city of Kyiv. The Red Army pounds the Germans in the center as the war rages on. Operation Barbarossa is now in its 11th week. The exhausted German army looks forward to its greatest achievement yet, but only as the Red Army sinks to new lows. Supply trucks are stuck in the mud as the panzers grasp for the encirclement of the southwestern front. Welcome to the 14th episode in the Kings and Generals Eastern Front weekly series. Last week we watched the southwestern front and the Bryansk front desperately try to hold Ukraine and the capital city of Kyiv. We also saw the advance on Leningrad regain some momentum as the Stavka reorganized the defense of the city. Army Group Center was forced to retreat from the Yelnya salient, taking thousands of casualties in the process. This week we will cover the second week of September, the 8th through 16th. First, let's take a short look at how the Nazi state was managing replacements for the campaign in the east. There were two main categories of replacements for the Wehrmacht: men and machines. Neither was in massive supply by the end of the summer of 1941. By late September, an official report would put German casualties above 500,000. 14 divisions were more than 4,000 men short, 40 more than 3,000 men short, and 30 were more than 2,000 men short. Meanwhile, the Heer had lost nearly 1,500 tanks and artillery. This was about one-third of the starting force. Only 47% of the tanks across all four panzer groups were operational, according to a 4th of September report, with many tanks needing spare parts for repairs. Hitler had ordered that all new tank production be held in a strategic reserve in Germany, with the desire to create new panzer divisions. It would take until the middle of September for Holder to get Hitler to understand that plans to capture Moscow, Operation Typhoon, required some replacements to be released. Only 96 tanks had been sent forward, a little more than 10% of the new production from June to the end of August. When Hitler allowed the strategic reserve of vehicles to be allocated for replacements, the Panzer Arm was in desperate straits. On the 15th, he released 60 Czech 38Ts, 150 Panzer IIIs, and 96 Panzer IVs, with an additional 310 replacement engines for the Panzer III. These numbers were completely inadequate. His only other concession was the transfer of 2 more complete panzer divisions to the 4th Panzer Group under Hauptner. The 2nd and the 5th Panzer Divisions had been unable to participate in the initial invasion due to their poor state of readiness following the Yugoslavia campaign in April. They had been rebuilt and brought with them about 450 new tanks. However, even the entire stock of production could not have rebuilt the Panzer Arm to its original numbers. Most of the new production was of the more modern designs, and these would make up for some of the obsolete models they started the invasion with. Even so, that was not completely true. 71 of the 800-odd tanks produced by German factories from June to the end of August were Panzer IIs. These vehicles had been inadequate in France in 1940. They were certifiably obsolete at the end of summer 1941. Yet production did not end in that year. As things stood, the Panzer Arm was significantly reduced from its June starting point. A complete rebuilding of the force was out of the question, as there were simply not enough available tanks. Further, Hitler forbade any attempt to make the panzer divisions whole. Instead, they were forced to amalgamate and make do. The Heer would be forced to take on Operation Typhoon with what it had. There was no other option. Army Group North had completed cutting off Leningrad by the end of the first week of September. The 8th of September is marked as the first day of the formal siege of the city. The Germans intended to completely blockade the Soviets, preventing anyone and anything from escaping. Lieb planned to reach the eastern shores of Lake Ladoga with his armor, thus stopping the Soviets from being able to supply the city across the lake. Because of Hitler's order on September 6th, Lieb would be forced to transfer the 41st, 56th and 57th Motorized and 8th Air Corps to Army Group Center by the 15th of September. He would only be left with 2 motorized divisions and 1 panzer division. Later, as a concession, Lieb would be allowed to keep hold of a 2nd Panzer Division. The latter, realizing that he needed everything he could get his hands on to accomplish his mission, moved up his timetables. The city was still strongly defended, and the Soviets had been preparing defenses for weeks. 3 armies, with a total of 452,000 men, held the perimeter. The various divisions and smaller units that comprised these armies were in varying states of readiness. To supplement these men, 3 divisions of People's Militia had been raised from the population of the city. The Baltic Fleet was also present in the harbour, consisting of 2 battleships and several smaller ships. We will discuss the role of the Soviet Navy in the siege of Leningrad in more depth in a future video. They were able to provide significant gunfire support to the defenders as the siege progressed, firing 358 barrages, which delivered 9,368 shells in September alone. East of the encircled city, the northwestern front was rebuilding. They would attempt to break the siege and seek to maintain the supply connection across Lake Ladoga. The 85,000-man strong 54th Army was assembling at Zhukov, while the remnants of the 48th Army held the front line. The Soviet defences formed a rough triangle around the city, bounded by Krasnoe in the south, Lake Ladoga and the Neva River in the east, and the Baltic in the west. Leningrad was already starting to feel the effects of the encirclement, as Leeb had brought up his large siege guns in the first week of the month. Now, as the second week began, they stepped up their bombardment. The massive artillery pieces were complemented by large-scale Luftwaffe bombing raids. One such raid set fire to the Badev warehouse, which stored the majority of Leningrad's foodstuffs. The Germans commenced their assault on the 9th of September. The 4th Panzer Group held the western lines around the city. Reinhardt's 41st Corps was the main effort in this next push. They were to take Krasnoe and push through Krasnoe Selo, punching a hole in the Soviet defences west and south of the city. The attack was successfully spearheaded by the 36th Motorized Infantry for 10 kilometers, before being stopped by concentrated land and naval artillery fire. The next day, they were counterattacked by the 42nd Army, following a large preparatory artillery barrage. A stalemate developed in the area between Krasnoe Selo and Krasnoe. The 1st Panzer was committed late on the 10th. They had some initial success, but more reinforcements were needed to crack the Soviet defences. Thus, Reinhardt threw in his last reserve formation, a single panzer battalion from the 8th Division. This did not decisively change the battle in the Germans' favour. By the 12th, it was Voroshilov's turn to send his last reserves into the Meat Grinder, a naval infantry brigade, and the newly formed 5th People's Militia Division. Despite this, Krasnoe Selo fell, and Krasnoe was being outflanked, but Pulkovo held. There was a small opportunity to capitalize on their success, but the Germans required additional reinforcements. There were none. The 8th Panzer was still reorganizing after its heavy August losses. Leeb now received explicit orders that the 41st Corps had to be transferred in good condition, despite them being the offensive spearhead. Leeb was also informed that the Soviet 54th Army was starting to attack his flanks. He was forced to desperately reorganize his line to cover for the gap created by the imminent departure of the majority of his panzer group, all whilst concentrating enough force to make another attempt at the city, and whilst keeping the outer lines of the blockade secure from Soviet attack. Reinhardt was to make one final assault before being allowed to redeploy. This week would also see Zhukov replace Voroshilov, who was ordered to return to Moscow and report directly to Stalin. Voroshilov's plan to demolish Leningrad's military facilities was cancelled, and a no-step-back order was issued on penalty of death. Zhukov was becoming the Stavka's fixer, and he set about preparing Leningrad for a long war. He focused on preparing the city itself for the fighting, and organized further call-ups of local civilians into the militia divisions. He would not have long before Reinhardt's hammer blow struck, and made gains despite frantic counterattacks, aerial bombardment, and artillery fire. All of Zhukov's attempts at a planned counter-offensive were preemptively foiled by the Germans, who attacked first. All he could do was feed reserves into local counterattacks, whilst attempting to form a fresh second echelon defensive line. The second defensive line was formed by the 16th, and stretched from the Gulf of Finland to the Neva River. Commanders were strictly forbidden by both Stalin and Zhukov from removing any troops from this line. The Germans reached the Gulf of Finland after capturing Oritsk on the 16th, isolating a Soviet army in the Iranian-bound bridgehead. German assaults eventually captured Krasnoe, but would become bogged down soon after against a fortified region. Army Group Center had a relatively quiet week. They were preparing for the upcoming Operation Typhoon. Field Marshal Bock would spend much of the month arguing with OKH for more resources and to stop formations from being pulled south. However, even a quiet week saw constant but small-scale attritional fighting along the front line, with the 4th and 9th Army being particularly hard hit. This was despite the western and reserve fronts being switched to defensive posture. Assaults were presaged by hours of continuous artillery barrages, betraying a supply situation that seemed impossible to the invaders. German artillery had been rationing ammunition for weeks at this point. Many soldiers of the Wehrmacht were incredulous that the Soviets could supply their forces with so much ammunition. While this fighting slowly sapped the strength of both sides, there was no risk of a major breakthrough from the Soviets. With the center seemingly stable, the attention of both the Stavka and OKH was currently in the south. Stalin's obstinacy over Kyiv, in the face of all advice from his military advisors, makes little sense in purely military terms. However, the city was the third largest in the USSR and historically important. To abandon it was politically devastating, with potential deleterious morale impacts on the defenders of Leningrad and Odessa. Furthermore, Stalin was eager to demonstrate to the USA and UK that the USSR was worthy of receiving aid. If it seemed that the USSR was about to capitulate soon, then nothing would be sent to the USSR. Kyiv could not be abandoned without a fight. Stalin had requested that Churchill create a second front against Germany, or failing that, put 20 to 30 British divisions into the USSR as an expeditionary force. This was refused as impossible. Furthermore, Stalin was not blind to the danger of Guderian's drive south, but he extremely overestimated the abilities of the Red Army, while underestimating the strength of the German divisions. He also believed that Guderian was likely positioning himself for a future flanking offensive to Moscow, rather than moving to encircle the forces at Kyiv. Even if Guderian continued south, Stalin believed Eremenko would stop the unfolding disaster. Eremenko was proving incapable of holding Guderian back, despite being promoted and reinforced. On the 7th, Marshal Shaposhnikov and his deputy Vasilevsky approached the Soviet dictator. They tried to get permission for the Southwestern Front to pull back, but they were denied. After much pleading, they were able to get permission for localized withdrawals from the 5th and 37th Armies, but no more. As for Guderian, the rain that turned everything into an impenetrable mud continued throughout the second week. His first week's movements had not impressed Bock. His relationship with the Field Marshal was already tenuous, and the pace of the advance was not helping. But finally, Guderian and Weich's Second Army offensives were starting to crack open Eremenko's slowly collapsing front. Modul's 3rd Panzer was able to break through one of these gaps and race to Romny on the 10th. This was planned to be the meeting point between Guderian and Kleist, but there was no sign of Kleist. In fact, Kleist had not even started his offensive. Fortunately, Romny had been a major staging area for the Red Army, and Modul's breakthrough had been so sudden and so fast that he managed to capture these stockpiles. This alleviated their logistical issues. Modul's fuel stocks had been nearly drained. There had not been enough to send his supply trucks back. It was uncertain if Schweppenberg even had the necessary supplies on hand for replenishment, even if trucks arrived. If not for the supply dump captured at Romny, September might have been much darker for the 3rd Panzer Division, and by extension, Guderian's entire offensive. Modul was in dangerous territory, as the small forward elements he had at Romny were completely isolated. Elsewhere, more of Guderian's divisions started to see sudden success. However, this also massively increased the front line that needed to be defended. The 47th Panzer Corps found itself defending a 150-kilometer front line, but had lost its last reconnaissance plane by the 13th, and there were no replacements available. Overstretched and now effectively blind, the Corps' best defense was to hope the enemy was in no state to attack them in force. Fortunately for them, the 40th Army's line was wrecked. Confusion reigned as they struggled to understand the situation. They could not effectively communicate and needed to pull back to reform their lines. However, 3 Soviet large columns were spotted marching towards Romny and 2 other towns, which bridged the Sula River. On the morning of the 11th, Modul sent forward a detachment to push south to Lokovitsy. If Kleist was not going to reach Modul, Modul would reach Kleist with all that remained of Guderian's spearhead. Lokovitsy and its bridge were captured on the 13th. Now the Kampfgruppe dug in to repel any Soviet attempts to flee, while hoping for any possible reinforcement and air support. Guderian's offensive was spent. It was down to Army Group South to complete the encirclement. When Dnipropetrovsk had been captured on the 26th of August, it had been done so by Kleist's motorized infantry alongside the panzers. When the infantry had failed to expand the bridgehead across the river, there had been no point relocating those tanks until a bridgehead had been secured either at Dnipropetrovsk or elsewhere. Even when the bridgehead at Kremenchuk had been secured and expanded, preparations needed for the breakthrough offensive still took time. Furthermore, it took until the 10th of September for 3 infantry corps of the 17th Army to finish deploying across the river. Thus, Kleist could not start his crossing until the 11th. This delay allowed Kleist's panzer divisions to be restored up to 100 operational tanks in 3 of the 4 divisions. The 4th would be restored only to 79 tanks. One estimate had the pre-refit panzer group degraded down to 1/3 of its initial pre-invasion strength and had been restored to approximately 50% strength. Several panzer divisions had undergone their refit around Dnipropetrovsk. This potentially deceived Kyiv about German intentions, resulting in the German bridgehead at Dnipropetrovsk suffering far more extensively from Red Army attacks. Also, far more Soviet reinforcements were filtered into heavy fighting at Dnipropetrovsk. Even still, the 38th Army at Kremenchuk sustained 40,000 casualties and 279 tanks lost from repeated failed attacks against the German infantry holding the bridgehead. Zeitzler would finally be permitted to withdraw from the Dnipropetrovsk bridgehead on the 10th. 13 artillery detachments had been ferried across in an attempt to expand the bridgehead, which alone would take nearly 6 days to withdraw. It was also pointless to withdraw in light of the upcoming offensive at Kremenchuk, so Zeitzler requested to be relieved by the infantry of the 17th Army instead, which was approved. The fighting in Dnipropetrovsk continued until well after Kleist broke out at Kremenchuk. Only on the 15th of September did the 14th Motorized Corps strike in the rear of the 6th Army to relieve the pressure on the Germans at Dnipropetrovsk. Notably, the Italian Expeditionary Corps found some success in the attack as well. This was one of the first major operations for the Italians in the Eastern Theatre. Mussolini was ecstatic. Finally, Kleist's offensive would start on the morning of the 12th. Huber's 16th Panzer, with artillery and air support, shattered 2 Soviet rifle divisions and raced to Semenovka by the afternoon. He would be stopped 15 kilometers short of Korel due to running completely out of fuel. This was compounded by the mud slowing the following 9th Division, who had not even completely crossed the river. If it were not for the complete lack of Red Army forces with sufficient strength or mobility, Huber's completely isolated division would have been in danger of being destroyed by a counterattack. Refueled overnight, the 16th would push to Lubny 40 kilometers from Model's advanced Kampfgruppe. There, the panzers would be stopped until the next day by fierce resistance from the NKVD, a worker militia and an anti-aircraft battery. Follow-on attacks by the 17th Army and the rest of Kleist's divisions would result in the virtual disintegration of Verklenke's 38th Army. Over the next 2 days, Kleist managed to get 3 panzer divisions across the river, supported by the 48th Motorized Infantry Corps. The Soviet 47th Tank Division attempted a flank attack against Kempf's Motorized Corps, but its remaining few dozen light tanks made little impact. With several panzer divisions behind their lines, panic started to spread across the entire southwestern front, with its southern and northern positions crumpling to the supporting German infantry offensives. By the end of the 13th, it was obvious that Kyiv was doomed. Only the 38th and 40th Armies remained free. The 38th was nearly shattered from the fighting at Kremenchuk, and the 40th was in a poor position to help. There were no reserve armies to break the encirclement, and he was tied to unfavorable defensive positions by Stalin's edicts. With more than 200 kilometers between the eastern front lines and safety, each day's delay doomed thousands. The first breakout attempts were conducted by rear area supply troops, with no heavy weapons or any cohesive command structure. Because of that, Model's force, despite being extremely outnumbered, were able to hold on to the river crossings. But despite the main bridges being held by the Germans, the encirclement was not hermetically sealed. Along the Darien's lines, breakout attempts would result in several surprise battles, with one example resulting in Schweppenberg's 24th Panzer Corps command post being suddenly attacked by a Soviet column and nearly overrun. The 9th Panzer broke through to Model's position at Lokovytsi and officially closed the encirclement on the 15th. Out of 261,696 men and 259 tanks committed to combat to stop Guderian, the Bryansk front suffered roughly 100,000 casualties and lost 140 tanks. Fewer than 200,000 men were available for combat across the entire Bryansk front. Stalin had kept faith in Eremenko for too long in the face of repeated requests from other officers. Eremenko's attacks had consumed the offensive capabilities of the Red Army, but the Germans were unaware of this. Officers up and down the chain of command were nervous about the exposed position the 2nd Panzer Group was in. Some of the panzer divisions were covering frontages of more than 90 kilometers. This was less than ideal in even the best conditions. However, unfamiliar terrain and poor supply meant the weakened divisions were being stretched to their limits. The weakness of Eremenko's front and the Stavka's inability to coordinate a strong attack anywhere along the line was the only thing that saved the 2nd Panzer Group from its own encirclement. German soldiers were exhausted, but the killing blow never came. The Red Army was in worse condition. The war was starting to resemble two punch-drunk boxers swaying back and forth, landing punches and eating them by the dozen. Neither army had the strength to finish the match, so the fighting went on. Stalin had allowed the encirclement of the southwestern front to happen through his refusal to allow a retreat. The only question remaining was how bad would it get? Would the Red Army survive the coming disaster? This concludes our discussion for this week. Next week we will continue the week-by-week account of the entire war on the Eastern Front. From June 1941 to May of 1945, we will track the war's progress. Stay tuned, and remember, this is just the beginning of the weekly Eastern Front of World War II series. Don't forget to subscribe, comment and share this video, it helps immensely. We've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.